And it is 12:15. Good afternoon and welcome everyone to the first Friday lecture for the month of June. Today's speaker is Cynthia Rutz, and her title is Homer's Humanity, Moments of Grace in the Iliad. Please note that this presentation is also being recorded and it will be available on the Graham School YouTube channel if you want to watch it later. Also, please be aware that you will not be able to unmute your microphones during the presentation as a courtesy to our speaker. You will be able to ask questions in the chat box. You can do so at any time during the presentation. Questions that you type into the chat box, I will keep track of, and then I will pose them to Cindy at the end of the lecture during our question and answer period. During the presentation itself, as I say, all will be muted except for our speaker. Cindy and I will be able to see your video, but we won't be able to hear you. So if you choose to leave your video on or to turn it off, it is at your discretion. Cindy's video will be spotlighted for the most part during the presentation. Consequently, the best way to view the lecture is to select speaker view instead of gallery view. Today's lecture is being sponsored by the Basic Program of Liberal Education for Adults at the University of Chicago's Graham School. My name is Kendall Sharp, and I am the Cyril O'Hoole Chair of the Basic Program. Before I properly introduce our speaker, I'd like to say a few words about the Basic Program, the Graham School, and our upcoming courses and events. Basic Program is a 4-year certificate program at the University of Chicago's Graham School of Continuing Studies. Graham offers an array of programs besides the Basic Program. Since 1946, we have offered our students a rigorous liberal arts curriculum based on the principle that there's no substitute for direct engagement with big ideas and their original texts. Through focused discussion, our classes provide direct encounters with some of the great works of classical and Western culture in a dedicated community of adult learners led by experienced University of Chicago educated instructors. Due to the current crisis, all of our classes currently take place remotely, with 2 exceptions, although in spring, registration for summer classes is now open. Our next First Friday lecture will happen on September 2nd, and the speaker will be Basic Program instructor David Shiner. The First Friday lecture series will take the summer off for the months of July and August. The series Conversations at Graham has one upcoming installment before the end of the academic year, namely a conversation with author Jennifer Armstrong, who will discuss writing novelistic nonfiction. This event occurs next Friday, June 10, running from noon to 12:45. As I mentioned before, this presentation is being recorded. The recording will be available to current and former students on the Graham School YouTube channel early next week. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker. Cynthia Rutz received her PhD from the University of Chicago in 2013. Her dissertation topic was Shakespeare's King Lear and its folk tale analogues, a subject on which she has delivered several lectures. For several years, she worked with Mortimer Adler on his Paideia project, an education reform project which encourages high school and elementary school teachers to help students think critically through great books, seminars, and coaching. Her academic interests include mythology, folktales, Milton, Willa Cather, and ancient Greek philosophy and literature. She joined the Basic Program in 1991, served as staff chair from 1999 to 2004, and is currently Director of Faculty Development at Valparaiso University. Now, it is my pleasure to turn things over to Cynthia Rutz. Cindy.
Okay, hold on a moment while I share my screen. Oops, hold on, something went wrong there. To get to the top. All right, I think we're technically good to go.
Good to go.
Kendall, you're seeing my first page there?
Yes, all
okay.
Good.
All right, thank you for that kind introduction, Kendall. Let me start by saying how privileged I feel to be able to read Homer and discuss it together with Basic Program students. We may be one of the few universities left in the US that still reads all of Homer outside of a classics department. And sadly, classics departments are now disappearing too. In the Basic Program, we spend 10 weeks reading the entire Iliad together. Even better, we follow that up with 6 weeks on Homer's sequel to the Iliad, the Odyssey. So BP students and instructors get steeped in Homer for a luxurious 16 weeks. Anything I have noticed about the text is a direct result of those many conversations with students about it. So I want to thank my students for that. Now, for those of you not familiar with Homer or who need a brief refresher, here's a little background. Homer's epic war poem, the Iliad, was written down around 750 BCE, but the story doubtless existed in the oral tradition for many centuries before that. The name Iliad comes from the name of the ancient city Ilium, also known as Troy, because the poem is set during the 9th year of the siege of Troy by a coalition of Greek warriors led by King Agamemnon. The cause of the war is that the Trojan prince Paris has eloped with the beautiful Helen, wife of Agamemnon's brother Menelaus. The Greeks, having arrived at Troy in 1,000 ships, are there to get her back. The poem itself never explains how Agamemnon, who is no great leader, was able to persuade so many Greeks to join him in this war. But Homer's audience would probably know the legend, which is that nearly all of these kings were suitors to Helen. So her father made them all take an oath that they would not attack whomever she chose as a husband, and that they would also unite to defend her. That is why the playwright Christopher Marlowe later dubs Helen of Troy the face that launched 1,000 ships. As the Iliad progresses, bloody battle scenes predominate more and more, with the wounds of the dying described in excruciating detail. As a result, the poem almost seems to celebrate violence. The action culminates in a rampage of the grief-crazed warrior Achilles, out to avenge the death of his best friend, Patroclus. Achilles mows down every Trojan in his path and finally kills the greatest Trojan warrior of them all, Hector, thus ensuring the fall of Troy. What then is Homer's intention in depicting all this violence in such bloody detail? The French mystic Simone Weil tries to answer that question in a short essay called The Iliad or the Poem of Force. Weil's essay was written in 1940, just after the fall of France to the Nazis, and her interpretation of the poem is clearly influenced by current events. She makes a compelling case that the whole point of the Iliad is to both sicken us with the inhumanity of war and to show us its bitter cost. Her first paragraph is worth quoting almost in full. The true hero, the true subject, the center of the Iliad is force. In this work, at all times, the human spirit is shown as modified by its relations with force, as swept away, blinded by the very force it imagined it could handle, as deformed by the weight of the force it submits to. For those dreamers who considered that force, thanks to progress, would soon be a thing of the past, the Iliad could appear as a historical document. For others, whose powers of recognition are more acute, and who perceive force today as yesterday, as at the very center of human history, the Iliad is the purest and the loveliest of mirrors. Force, then, according to Weil, deforms both the strong and the weak. Achilles, the strongest warrior in the Iliad, is just as blinded and deformed by force as are the poor wretches whom he slays without pity. Weil, who was an anti-war activist, wants us to understand this clearly so that we do not fail to see in our own times how force crushes and deforms the human spirit, how it deprives us of our very humanity. Indeed, her definition of force is that which turns anybody who is subjected to it into a thing. Yet Weil goes on to point out that the Iliad also contains moments of grace, times when characters do treat each other humanely, or times when we meet on a plane that takes us temporarily away from the violence. As, for example, when a goddess mother laments that she cannot comfort her son, who is mourning the loss of his best friend, or when a father tenderly cradles his baby after the child is frightened by his war gear, or when a dying soldier gets a poignant eulogy that evokes the life he left back home. As Weil notes, quote, "These moments of grace are rare in the Iliad, but they are enough to make us feel with sharp regret what it is that violence has killed and will kill again." So according to Weil, even these moments that seem to take us away from the conflict are therefore still part of the story of force. These brief scenes of humanity show us what is going to be lost or has already become lost through the violence of war. So this lecture will focus on these moments of grace in the Iliad in order to see how these scenes that take us away from the war actually serve to demonstrate all the more the war's bitter cost. Section 1, Eulogies for the Dying. To begin with, we will look at some of the short eulogies that Homer provides for his fighters. These consist of a few short lines spoken by the narrator about a soldier's life just before the man falls to the ground dead. In these brief lines, Homer gives us both a name and also a brief remembrance of some otherwise unsung fighter. There are literally hundreds of these short eulogies in the Iliad. Indeed, it is rather a shock to modern readers to learn that almost no one dies in battle in the Iliad without being named. Of the 308 battle deaths depicted in the poem, 257 of them are named. In fact, all of the unnamed deaths in the Iliad happen in just 3 large groups. I will not address these 3 episodes in this talk, but you can ask me about them afterwards if you're interested. Now, contrast Homer's continual naming of the dying warriors with a modern war film, where we typically see scene after scene of unnamed soldiers being slaughtered by the dozens. One commentator has even compared the poem to a war monument on which we carve the names of those who have died in battle. But Homer goes much farther than merely naming and putting a name on a war memorial. In just a few short lines, he gives us not just a name, but also a eulogy. Through the pileup of these short and poignant vignettes, Homer makes us feel the full weight of what is lost in war. So now let's take a look at a few of these brief eulogies. The first example comes from the famous Catalogue of Ships, in which each Greek leader is described along with the men and the arms he brings. Here is where we learn about the very first man to die in this war. Protesilaus had led these troops while he still lived, but now for many years the arms of the black earth had held him fast, and his wife was left behind, alone in Phyllis, both cheeks torn in grief, their house half built. Just as he vaulted off his ship, a Dardan killed him, first by far of the Argives slaughtered on the beaches. So the unlucky Protesilaus never even sets foot on the shore of Troy. One cannot help but think of the World War II and the beaches at Normandy, where so many young men, also first off the boats, lost their lives. Some of them, too, would doubtless leave behind a grieving widow, an unfinished house. As in many wars, most of the dying warriors in the Iliad are young men. Sir Homer often shows us not a grieving wife, but grieving parents. Here is an account of the death of one such youth. And Telamonian Ajax struck Anthemius' son, the hardy stripling Simoisius, still unwed. His mother had borne him along the Simois banks when she trailed her parents down the slopes of Ida to tend their flocks, and so they called him Simoisius. But never would he repay his loving parents now for the gift of rearing, his life cut short too soon, brought down by the spear of lion-hearted Ajax. We have never met this youth before his sudden death, but in these few lines, Homer tells us that his family were shepherds, that he got his name from the river where he was born, and that he was just a boy. Even more poignant is the death of one of the youngest sons of Troy's King Priam. This young man had been captured by Achilles earlier in the war and sold into slavery. Ransomed by a family friend, the boy returns home in Book 21. However, by this stage of the war, no one is being taken prisoner or ransomed any longer. And first, Achilles met a son of Dardan Priam, Lycaon, the very man Achilles had seized himself once on a midnight raid and hauled from his father's orchard, resisting all the way. He was pruning a young fig with his sharp bronze hook, cutting green branches to bend for chariot rails, when a sudden blow came down on him in the dark. The grim marauder Achilles. That was the time Achilles shipped him to Lemnos fortress, sold him off. But a stranger there released him from his chains. From there he slipped away to his father's house, but only 11 days he cheered his heart with friends. Then on the 12th, some god cast him into Achilles' hands again, and now he would send him off on a new journey, resisting all the way to the house of death. Homer here evokes in us sadness for the terrible luck of this young man. He is probably too young to fight when he is first seized by Achilles, while the boy is working in his father's orchard. He escapes death, spends some time as a slave, gets a short respite, and then the very day when he enters the war for the first time as a soldier, he is thrown right back into the pitiless hands of Achilles. Note that in these brief vignettes before dying, no distinction is made by Homer between Greeks and Trojans. Both alike are honored, named, and given a short eulogy. Simone Weil notes this surprising equity of Homer's. Quote, "Nothing precious is scorned, whether or not death is its destiny. No man is set above or below the condition common to all men. Whatever is destroyed is regretted. Victors and vanquished are brought equally near us. There may be, unknown to us, other expressions of the extraordinary sense of equity which breathes through the Iliad. Certainly it has not been imitated. One is barely aware that the poet is a Greek and not a Trojan." Unquote. So in these brief eulogies, Homer emphasizes the cost of war for both sides. A similar effect is achieved in Ken Burns' video series on the American Civil War. Burns uses poignant letters from soldiers, wives, siblings, and parents to show us the effect of war on both North and South. Through these letters, we again see the grieving widow, the unfinished house, the parents who will never see their son's wedding. In Homer's day, the effect on his audience would have been even more direct. If we imagine Homer or another bard reciting this poem in a small village square, we can be sure that some parents in the crowd would be weeping at one of these eulogies, grieving for their own son, whose life was cut short too soon. Section 2, Homer's similes. Another way that Homer temporarily removes us in space and time from the bloody events of the war he is narrating is through the use of his famous similes. These similes compare the horrors of war to familiar episodes from ordinary life, scenes of harvest time, of the stars at night, or of shepherds fighting off mountain lions to protect their sheep. Commentator Eva Braun explains why she thinks Homer uses these devices. Quote, "The reason is plain. The Iliad is full of the real ugliness and brutality of war, close at hand and described in incessant detail. Teeth knocked out, gullets pierced, nipples punctured, chests crushed. The horror needs the saving grace of the simile's distancing double vision." But Simone Weil notes that these similes, although they may evoke a more peaceful world, still carry with them the horror of war. Quote, "Insofar as this other life, the life of the living, seems calm and full, these brief evocations of the world of peace are felt as pain." Unquote. Here is the example that Weil gives in her essay. This simile comes at a time when, after fighting all morning, the Argives finally break through the Trojan lines. As long as the morning rose and the blessed day grew stronger, the weapons hurtled side to side and men kept falling. But just when the woodsman makes his morning meal, deep in a mountain forest, arm weary from chopping the big heavy trunks, and his heart has had enough, and sudden longing for tempting food overtakes the man and makes his senses whirl, just at the height of morning, the Argives smashed battalions, their courage breaking through, and they shouted ranks of cohorts on along the lines. So for a full 5 lines, we are away from the battle. We are in the forest with the woodsman, feeling his weariness after chopping wood all morning and his desire for food and rest. But once we leave the simile and return to the battle, the full force of this comparison hits us. Those big heavy trunks that the woodcutter is arm weary from chopping are now the trunks, that is the bodies, of men. It is individual men, not tree trunks, who kept falling. When the Argives break through the lines, it is the men in those battalions who are being smashed. So far from giving us a true respite from the war, these similes weave scenes of home and scenes of war together. In a way, the poet has tricked us into understanding how it feels to become arm weary from chopping and hacking the bodies of men all morning. Another simile that starts out charmingly and then turns dark is one in which the goddess Athena, protecting the Greek warrior Menelaus, is compared to a mother protecting her sleeping child. Athena diverts a deadly arrow from her favorite, as follows. But you, Menelaus, the blessed deathless gods did not forget you, Zeus's daughter, the queen of fighters, first of all. She reared before you, skewed the tearing shaft, flicking it off your skin as quick as a mother flicks a fly from her baby sleeping softly. Athena's own hand deflected it. Notice that Menelaus is addressed by the narrator in the first person, as you in this passage. But you, Menelaus, the blessed deathless gods did not forget you. Homer startles us a few times in the poem by using the personal form of address to a select few of the warriors. Imagine the use that a bard could make of this first-person address as he recites the Iliad in a small village town. He could walk right up to a young man saying, "You, Menelaus, the blessed gods did not forget you." He could even mime flicking away an arrow from the young man's skin. Or if there happened to be a woman with a child or baby in the audience, he could mime flicking a fly off the baby's skin. Either way, the effect on the audience would be electric, bringing this war simile right into their midst. This moment between mother and child could be viewed as sweet or funny. However, Homer does not end the episode here. This is war, so Athena does not let Menelaus get off scot-free. Instead of stopping the arrow, she merely deflects it so that it strikes Menelaus in a less deadly spot. Quote, "The tip of the weapon grazing the man's flesh, and the dark blood came spurting from the wound." So the simile breaks here, because Homer knows that even the goddess's watchful care cannot protect one long in the midst of bloody war. Moreover, as any mother knows, the flies just keep on coming. Just as in war, the arrows or the bullets keep on coming. Homer immediately follows this line about the dark blood spurting with a rather gruesome simile comparing Menelaus's bleeding wound with a woman dyeing ivory for a war horse's decoration. Quote, "Picture a woman dyeing ivory blood red, a Carian or Maeonian staining a horse's cheekpiece, and it's stored away in a vault, and troops of riders long to sport the ornament, true, but there it lies, a king's splendor, kept and prized twice over, his team's ornament, his driver's pride and glory. So now, Menelaus, the fresh blood went staining down your sturdy thighs, your shins, and well-turned ankles." Once again, we are carried out of the war briefly, admiring the artistry of this ornamental bridal piece made of ivory. The emphasis here is on how well regarded this ornament is, coveted by many, but owned by the king and kept under lock and key. I doubt if anyone in Homer's audience knew where this simile was headed, despite the hint that the ivory was stained blood red. So from the red-stained bridal piece, a king's pride and glory, we end with Menelaus' blood-red stained legs, a sight that frightens both him and his brother. Agamemnon shudders, and Menelaus cringes to see the dark blood gushing from the wound. Both soon realize that this is a flesh wound, though, and they send for the healer. So once again, the simile, which seemed to give us a brief respite from the war to another time and place, only makes the ever-present horrors of war, such as limbs stained red with blood, all the more poignant. In another extended simile, Homer compares a dying warrior to a lovely young olive tree. Here is Homer's description of the death of the Trojan warrior Euphorbus at the hands of Menelaus. "He fell with a crash, armor ringing against his ribs, his locks like the Grace's locks, splashed with blood, still braided tight with gold and silver clasps, pinched in like a wasp's waist. There he lay, like an olive slip a farmer rears to strength on a lonely hilltop, drenching it down with water, a fine young stripling tree, and the winds stir it softly, rustling from every side, and it bursts with silver shoots. Then suddenly out of nowhere a wind in gale force comes storming, rips it out of its trench, stretches it on the earth. Just so Panthous' stripling son lay sprawled in death." Even today, we use that word stripling for a young child who is shooting up fast in growth. Some similes resonate across the ages. Homer lets us dwell here for a while with this farmer and the young olive tree that he is nursing along, We picture his daily watering and then his pride when he finds his nursling finally bursting with silver shoots. So when that gale force wind comes along and rips it up by the roots, we find ourselves mourning the loss along with the farmer, just for a moment. Then, when we leave the simile and get back to the battle, we realize that we are also mourning along with the boy's father, who had reared his own son like that dear olive stripling, only to have the gale force wind of war stretch him out on the earth. I will give Simone Weil the last word on Homer's similes. Quote, "Whatever is not war, whatever war threatens or destroys, the Iliad wraps in poetry. The realities of war, never." Unquote. Section 3, 2 family scenes. Rarely do we get a glimpse of family life in the Iliad, but when those scenes occur, they are, of course, tainted with the ongoing war. The most memorable family scene in the Iliad takes place between the Trojan warrior Hector, his wife Andromache, and their baby boy. Hector has briefly left the battlefield on a mission to ask the women of Troy to offer sacrifices to Athena to help turn the war in their favor. The mission will be fruitless because we are told that Athena refuses to hear their prayers. But while he is back in Troy, Hector takes the time to visit his family, and his warm, generous wife came running up to meet him. However, the family reunion is marred by thoughts of war. Quote, "Andromache joined him now, and following in her steps, a servant holding the boy against her breast, in the first flush of life, only a baby. The great man of war, breaking into a broad smile, his gaze fixed on his son in silence. Andromache, pressing close beside him and weeping freely now, clung to his hand, urging him, called him, 'Reckless one, my Hector, your own fiery courage will destroy you.'" Both Hector and his wife then go on to lament the probable outcome of the war, that Troy will fall and Andromache be taken captive, a sight Hector hopes not to live to see. But there is a moment when terror turns to humor. Quote, "In the same breath, shining Hector reached down for his son, but the boy recoiled, cringing against his nurse's full breast, screaming out at the sight of his own father, terrified by the flashing bronze, the horsehair crest, the great ridge of the helmet nodding, bristling terror. So it struck his eyes. And his loving father laughed. His mother laughed as well, and glorious Hector, quickly lifting the helmet from his head, set it down on the ground, fiery in the sunlight, and raising his son, he kissed him, tossing him in his arms." Hector goes on to pray to the gods that his son will grow up to be, quote, "a better man than his father." But as many in the audience would know, Hector's prayer will be in vain. For once Troy has fallen, the victorious Greeks will kill Hector's son, tossing the boy from the battlements of the city. Therefore, this family scene, much like the short vignettes before a warrior dies, merely serves to show us what is about to be lost. Indeed, his family visit ends with a lament for Hector, as if he were already dead. Andromache gathers together the women of the household, quote, "and stirring them all to a high pitch of mourning. So in his house they raised the dirges for the dead, for Hector still alive. His people were so convinced that never again would he come home from battle, never escape the Argives' rage and bloody hands." So even for his listeners who do not know the ultimate outcome, Homer makes sure that this scene ends with a song of mourning for Hector and the family life that he will never experience again. The parental laughter thus ends in tears, as the high cost of war is once again Homer's theme. Now from a scene of father, mother, and son, let us turn to a scene of mother and son, namely Achilles and his mother Thetis, the sea nymph. The humanity in this scene is ironically provided by the goddess Thetis, mourning for the deep distress and imminent death of her mortal child, Achilles. The episode takes place immediately after Achilles has just learned of the death of his best friend. He is so overwhelmed with grief that one of his companions, quote, "clutched Achilles' hands as he wept his proud heart out, for fear he would slash his throat with an iron blade," unquote. Achilles suddenly loosed a terrible wrenching cry, and his goddess mother heard, even away in the depths of the ocean, surrounded by her fellow sea nymphs, and echoed his sorrow. She, quote, cried out in turn and launched the following dirge for her son. Hear me, sisters, daughters of Nereus, so you will all know it well. Listen to all the sorrows welling in my heart. I am agony, mother of grief and greatness, O my child. Yes, I gave birth to a flawless, mighty son, the splendor of heroes, and he shot up like a young branch, like a fine tree I reared him, the orchard's crowning glory, but only to send him off in the beaked ships to Troy, to battle Trojans. Never again will I embrace him striding home through the door of Peleus' house. And long as I have him with me, still alive, looking into the sunlight, he is racked with anguish. And I go to his side. Nothing I can do to help him, nothing. But go I shall, to see my darling boy, to hear what grief has come to break his heart, while he holds back from battle. These are the words of a mother who has sent her son off to war, knowing he can never return, and that until his last breath he will still be mourning the loss of his best friend. I must admit that merely because Thetis is a goddess, I had for years failed to see the deep motherly sorrow in this lament. That is, I failed to see it until a student in my Iliad class read Thetis' lament with such feeling that she had several of us near tears. That student made me see that Homer's words here truly capture the grief of a mother who longs to help her suffering child, even her adult child, but cannot. Surely Homer's auditors, then and now, hear in this lament not the glory of war, but rather its great cost. Thetis is no Spartan mother stoically urging her son bound for war to come back with his shield or on it. Rather, she would save her son from war and its violence if she could. But what she can do for him, she does, as we were about to see. Section 4, the Shield of Achilles. So far, the moments of grace we have looked at in the Iliad have been very brief. We have examined some short eulogies that gave us glimpses of the home life of a dying man. We have looked at similes that take us out of the war for a few short lines. And finally, these two brief scenes of family life. But by far the most detailed view that we get in the Iliad of the human world outside this war are the scenes depicted on Achilles' shield. First, some background about the famous shield. Although Achilles' mother Thetis cannot cure her son's deep grief, she does promise to provide him with splendid new armor, made by a god, to replace his own armor that was captured by Hector in battle. To procure this armor, Thetis goes to visit the great artisan god Hephaestus. Although he is a cripple, Hephaestus in his smithy, creates such wonderful things as cauldrons that wheel themselves and golden female assistants who help him with his creations. The smith god owes Thetis a favor. For years ago, when his mother Hera threw him out of heaven for being a cripple, Thetis and the other ocean nymphs saved his life and hid him for several years. Partly because of his suffering, scholar Eva Braun calls Hephaestus, quote, the only god who has weight, human weight, for Homer. He is the god who achieves in his divine smithy in pictures what Homer does on earth. He makes a world. Recall that the other gods are not creator gods. They make nothing of consequence. All but this one, who is lame, as Homer is blind. Unquote. Who better, then, to create a work of art that depicts the whole of human life, both its joys and its sorrows? Sympathizing with Thetis' own sorrow, Hephaestus agrees to make for Achilles, quote, armor that any man in the world of men will marvel at, through all the years to come, whoever sees its splendor. So while Thetis waits, Hephaestus forges spectacular armor for Achilles out of durable bronze and tin and priceless gold and silver. But above all, he makes a remarkable shield, on which he depicts the entire cosmos, encircled by, quote, ocean rivers' mighty power, girdling round the outermost rim of the welded, indestructible shield. The description of the many scenes Hephaestus places on this shield take up 130 lines in the poem. This is perhaps Hephaestus and Homer's lengthiest commentary on war and peace. First, he depicts both a city at peace and a city at war. The city at peace shows us both a joyful wedding and a contentious trial. First is the wedding scene, with multiple brides, dancing grooms, torches, music, and joyful spectators. Next, in the marketplace, we see a dispute with two men struggling over the blood price for a kinsman just murdered. But both sides submit the judgment to a circle of city elders, with a prize for the judge who'd speak the straightest verdict. Next, Hephaestus depicts a city at war, with an armed camp conducting a siege. It is impossible not to draw the analogy to Troy. But in this city, Ares and Pallas Athena tower over the city's troops, who are staging a raid. However, they attack not enemy soldiers, but shepherds, oxen, and sheep meant to feed the enemy soldiers. The besiegers mount a counterattack, and then we get a horrific scene of war straight out of the battle scenes in the Iliad. Quote, "And strife and havoc plunged in the fight, and violent death, now seizing a man alive with fresh wounds, now one unhurt, now hauling a dead man through the slaughter by the heels, the cloak on her back stained red with human blood. So they clashed and fought like living, breathing men, grappling each other's corpses, dragging off the dead." So what message is Hephaestus and Homer intending to convey in depicting these two cities? To begin with, the city at peace is an anomaly in this setting. Decoration on a shield is typically meant either to show one's lineage or to strike fear into the heart of one's opponent. So this final description of strife, havoc, and death is exactly what one might expect to find on a Bronze Age shield. Here is one example. This shield depicts a god leaping over a bull, holding a lion over his head. The god is attended by winged creatures, seemingly celebrating his prowess. Another shield described in the Iliad, that of Agamemnon, is also a fearsome spectacle. Quote, "Circling the center, 10 strong rings of bronze with 20 discs of glittering tin set in. At the heart, a boss of bulging blue steel, and there like a crown, the Gorgon's grim mask, the burning eyes, the stark, transfixing horror. And round her strode the shapes of rout and fear. The shield belt glinted silver, and rippling on it ran a dark blue serpent, 2 heads coiling round a third, reared from a single neck, and twisting left and right." So Agamemnon's shield features Gorgons, rout, fear, and a 3-headed serpent. Now this is a shield that fulfills its function, to intimidate one's opponent with images of horror. So why then does Hephaestus bother to also depict a city at peace on Achilles' shield? Since it cannot be to frighten his opponent, the message must be for Achilles. One possible meaning is that Hephaestus wants to remind Achilles, and perhaps us, that we humans have a choice of how to live. The philosopher Hobbes, for example, paints us a word picture of life in our natural state versus civil life in order to convince us to choose and keep choosing civil society despite restrictions on our original freedom, including the freedom to take vengeance. The alternative, the state of nature, Hobbes famously describes as a condition of perpetual war, in which life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So could the message of Hephaestus' shield be that even now, Achilles could choose the path of peace rather than the path of war? In fact, Achilles might just be open to such a choice, for he is practically the only Greek fighter at Troy to ever question the war. In the very first scene of the poem, Achilles says this to Agamemnon, and in front of all the Greek leaders: "It wasn't Trojan spearmen who brought me here to fight. The Trojans never did me damage, not in the least. They never stole my cattle or my horses. Never in Phthia, where the rich soil breeds strong men, did they lay waste my crops. How could they? Look at the endless miles that lie between us." The scholar Caroline Alexander has noted that Achilles' words here resemble those of Muhammad Ali in his famous refusal to fight in Vietnam. Quote, "I got no quarrel with the Viet Cong. No Viet Cong ever called me names. I am not going 10,000 miles to help murder, kill, and burn other people." Alexander notes that the words of both Achilles and Ali were considered especially dangerous because they were clearly voicing what many others thought but were afraid to say. So, early on in the epic, Achilles has spoken as one who might well choose peace over war. Later, he even threatens to withdraw with all his troops. But by the time Hephaestus is creating the shield for him, Achilles can no longer choose not to fight. He is determined to avenge the death of his best friend, and for him, there is no longer any turning back. Of course, Hephaestus realizes that Achilles will have to die at Troy, that no other life is possible for him any longer. So perhaps the god provides these images on the shield to at least give Achilles a glimpse of the world he has given up. In addition to the two cities, Hephaestus also depicts on the shield pastoral scenes, a field being plowed, a vineyard at harvest time, shepherds fending off a lion. He ends with a dancing circle with both boys and girls rapturously dancing. Quote, "A breathless crowd stood round them, struck with joy, and through them a pair of tumblers dashed and sprang, whirling and leaping headsprings, leading on the dance." Before starting work on the armor, Hephaestus had said to Achilles' mother, "If only I could hide him away from pain and death, that day his grim destiny comes to take Achilles." Of course, he cannot do that. But perhaps what the great forger can do is to give Achilles a piece of art that depicts the whole of life, including those peaceful scenes that he will never experience again. But such a gift at such a time can only be a bitter one. As one scholar puts it, quote, "The new shield Achilles will bear before him into war underscores the enormity of all that he is to lose, which is all of life," unquote. So Achilles, consumed with rage, cannot make a different choice in the Iliad. However, those of you who have read the Odyssey, Homer's sequel to the Iliad, know that perhaps Achilles did finally come to understand the message of Hephaestus' shield. In the Odyssey, the living Odysseus goes down to the underworld, that is to Hades, where he encounters the ghost of Achilles who died at Troy. When Odysseus congratulates him for being a renowned figure in the underworld due to his status as a great warrior, Achilles demurs, saying, "I would rather wish just to be as a field serf in service to another, even to a man without allotment who had not much to live on, than to be lord over all the dead that have utterly perished." So now, far from being famous, Achilles would prefer to be anonymous, a mere field hand working for a poor farmer. Fame seemed important in the land of the living, but Achilles would rather be alive and lowly rather than be king of the dead. Those of you who read Paradise Lost with me last summer will realize that Milton's Satan makes the opposite choice. He declares that, quote, "It's better to reign in hell than serve in heaven." So it's my fancy that Achilles in the underworld has been brooding on these peaceful scenes on the shield, the plowing, the harvest festivals, the dancing. So perhaps he finally got the point of Hephaestus' art and has learned to value a more peaceful, quiet, uneventful life. But now what about us? Just as Achilles was the audience for Hephaestus' work of art, we are the audience for Homer's poetic work of art. What are we supposed to learn from these moments of grace in the Iliad? The eulogies, the similes, the family scenes, and finally the great shield itself. For that, I would like to turn to another writer about war. In 1990, Tim O'Brien, a Vietnam vet, wrote The Things They Carried, a prize-winning book of short fiction about the men with whom he fought in that war. He defends his choice to write about war in a fictional way in the chapter called How to Tell a True War Story. Quote, "In any war story, but especially a true one, it's difficult to separate what happened from what seemed to happen. There was always that surreal seemingness, which makes the story seem untrue, but which in fact represents the hard and exact truth as it seemed. Absolute occurrence is irrelevant. A thing may happen and be a total lie. Another thing may not happen and be truer than the truth." So if O'Brien is right, then Homer's intent with these moments of grace may be to tell us the real truth about war via things that are not happening on the battlefield. The surrealness of Menelaus's legs being stained with blood, just as a woman stains ivory for decoration, may capture something truer than the truth about the horror of being wounded in battle. Or perhaps, to really tell the truth about war, about death in war, Homer thinks we have to know something about the dying soldier's grieving wife and half-built house. Even the episodes depicted on the shield that seem to have nothing to do with war, the weddings, the harvest festival, the dancing circle, may tell us something we need to know about war. Again, Tim O'Brien puts it best, so I will give him the last word. And in the end, of course, a true war story is never about war. It's about sunlight. It's about the special way that dawn spreads out on a river, when you know you must cross that river and march into the mountains and do things you are afraid to do. It's about love and memory. It's about sorrow. It's about sisters who never write back and people who never listen. The end.
Thank you very much, Cindy. And where am I? There I am. We have a number of questions that I've harvested from the chat stream. And let me encourage folks to continue to add them. And I'll check back over there during the Q&A. Also, as is our monthly practice, at the end of the Q&A, I'm going to unmute everybody so that you'll have an opportunity to fill Cindy's ears with the applause she so richly deserves after a wonderful lecture. But now let me start with the questions. The first question, Cindy, is from Ray Lucchese, who asks, the underlying thread of the Iliad is all about Achilles and Agamemnon and their relationship, Achilles' anger and his more pressing anger at Patroclus' death. The ongoing war horrors which permeate the Iliad just seem like the canvas where Achilles and Agamemnon act out their jealousy of one another. But the moments of grace seem lacking within this frame. I guess if the central theme of Iliad is the horrors of war, why have the anger or jealousy between Achilles and Agamemnon as the poem's central plot?
Oh, okay. Yeah, intriguing question. I think the Iliad functions on several levels. So you're right, the very opening lines, sorry, let me grab it and read, indicate that the topic is going to be that fight between Achilles and Agamemnon. And I'll say one of the things I love about the translation by Fagles is that he makes sure to get the first word right. So let me read the first couple of lines. Rage, goddess, sing the rage of Peleus' son Achilles, murderous, doomed, that cost the Achaeans countless losses, hurling down to the house of death so many sturdy souls. And then we'll soon find out that the rage is at Agamemnon. So he's right, the stated theme right from the beginning is the quarrel between Agamemnon and Achilles. But I think by that first word being rage, the very first word in the Greek is rage, it really says, yes, one theme is about the anger between these two men, but anger, rage, force is really the greater theme. So it isn't just Achilles' rage, it's the battle rage of many in this story. So I think the deeper question of the Iliad is why this rage? Why war? Why do we keep fighting? What is it about us that has to keep conducting wars? And so it's about Achilles' rage, but it's also about our rage. Why can't we stay in the peaceful city? Why do we keep fighting? So that's so I see both themes going on at once, the theme between these two men and also the larger theme of rage and war.
Thanks, Cindy. Thank you, Ray, for your question. Next question comes from Brian Renaud, who asks, very interesting interpretation, but is it realistic to think that the most universally famous poet of war-torn ancient Greece was pleading for peace rather than celebrating war?
Yeah, I don't think Homer would say that he was an anti-war activist. They clearly was. But I think he and O'Brien share this, that they both want to write about the realities of war. They want to tell you what is war really like. Now, you can draw your own conclusions after that. You've just told me what it's really like, and I say, never again. We shouldn't be doing it. But even O'Brien in his book admits there's a beauty to war. And a friend of mine who's a fan or a student of the Civil War talks about a quote by Robert E. Lee looking at a battlefield where there's just about to be fought a battle. He said, thank God that war is so painful because it's so beautiful. We would love it otherwise. So there's something, both the glory and the horror at once. And I think you're right. I don't think Homer said or thought he was writing an anti-war poem. I do think he thought he was writing a poem that told the truth about war. And then in doing so, I think most of us who read it say, let this not happen again. It's in our reaction to it.
Thank you, Cindy. Thank you, Brian, for your question. Next question comes from Donald Weaver. Actually, it's a comment. He says, earlier this year, I read Homer on Life and Death by Jasper Griffin, which covers much the same topic. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Donald.
Oh.
Mark Eleveld says, this lecture is wonderful. Thank you on behalf of Cindy, Mark. The next question comes from Jay Tremblay, who asks, how could we compare Homeric war poetry to another well-known example of war poetry, that of English poets writing about their combat experiences during the Great War?
Yeah. Oh, that's a good question. And I'm thinking of the poets, a couple of whom died in the trenches, writing about the horrors of war. And I'm particularly, I guess, and I'm not sure if it's Wilfred Owens, who writes about the great palace lie, dulce decorum est pro patria mori, how good and noble it is to die for one's country. And he is saying it is not good and noble. I've been there, and it's just horror. So what about Homer? I think you do see some of that glory. For example, I'm going to quote, very similar to that war poet is Hector, talking to his brother. His brother has just interpreted a bird sign that seems to indicate that they should retreat. And Hector ignores it. And he says, the only bird sign the only omen I care about is to fight for your country. And I think as we hear that, we honor Hector for saying that. We say, yes, you are a noble warrior fighting for, the peace of your city. And we also see the death and destruction of the war. So bizarrely, I would almost say that both the views of those World War I poets who said it's a lie to say that war is glory, that's in the Iliad, and so are scenes where someone does talk about the glory of war, or talks about fighting for your country. So I think in depicting war, Homer, he encompasses it all. I think you see both views in here.
Thank you, Cindy. Thank you, Jay, for your question. Here's a shorty, also from Ray Lucchese. Ray asks, was Homer blind?
Yes. I mean, I and others like to keep up that idea. We have no idea is the answer. But the reason this idea got around is that there is a depiction of a bard in the Odyssey. Kendall could come up with the name, I think. Demodocus, there we go. And there's a scene of him reciting some exploits of the war. And so a lot of people have extrapolated from that, said, okay, the person who puts a blind poet in their poem, likely that person's blind. But we really do not know. It's just a sort of a nice myth that we keep promulgating about Homer.
Thank you, Cindy. Whoops. And thank you, Ray. The next question, Sheila Barrett asks, what translation of the Iliad would you recommend? And I'll add, and why?
Okay. Well, I am not, one of my life goals is to read Homer in the original Greek. I cannot right now read Homer in the original Greek, so I can't say from the point of view of knowing the Greek and knowing the translations. But I can say from the point of view of, the basic program has taught many translations over the years. We kind of switch it up every few years, partly for the sake of the instructors. We feel like we should be trying out different translations. And I'd say they all have their pluses and minuses. And I didn't like Fagles at first. I didn't find him very poetic. I found him very plain speaking. But I've come to love him. I have to admit, I especially some of the choices he makes. And like I say, that first line is the telling thing. The first word in Greek is rage, and he makes sure the first word in English is rage. So I'm going to go with Fagels for now. But I hope that we change translations in a couple of years, and then I get to try out another one.
Thanks, Cindy. Thanks, Sheila. The next comment comes from Barbara Bermudez, who says, exceptional timely lecture. And then here's a question from Elizabeth Evans. But in the Odyssey, doesn't Achilles ask about his son in a way that indicates he wants his son to be a famous warrior?
He does, yes. There's that two-sidedness. So on the one hand, he makes it sound like if I had to do it all over again, I would not fight at Troy. I'd go pull a plow behind some poor man's, cattle. But then he asks about his son, as do some of the other people in the underworld. So there's this idea that, in some way, the glory of their sons affects them, to the degree that some of you who've read Aristotle's Ethics know that he asks the question, does what happens after you're dead affect you? So that if your son turns out to be a rotter, and you hear about that, does that make you unhappy in the underworld? Does that affect your happiness? It's because the Greeks really took that seriously, the idea that what your kids do matters. So yes, Achilles still has kind of a foot in that glory world via his son too. So I think, yeah, you're right, there's two sides to what Achilles is thinking in the underworld.
Thank you, Cindy. And thank you, Elizabeth. The next question comes from John McManaman, who asks, what does the final scene tell us about war and violence when Achilles gives Priam Hector's body back?
Well, it's not the final scene, but it's towards the end. We end with the funeral of Hector. But I do want to address that scene because as I was telling friends about what I was going to talk about, they said, well, you definitely are going to talk about that scene between Achilles and Priam, right? Because talk about humanity, here's a father coming, Achilles is so angry, he's been, tearing that body of his enemy to shreds. The gods keep preserving it, but here's the father now come to beg for his son's corpse. And we assume, given how angry Achilles is, that he won't be successful. But Priam enters his tent, and Achilles and Priam have these moments together. For a while, they're both crying. Achilles is crying about his dead best friend, and Priam is crying about Hector. And they reach a sort of rapprochement, and Achilles gives him the body to take back to Troy. The reason I didn't include that scene, by the way, is rereading Simone Weil, she convinced me that too is a scene of force. That though he does give the body back, at all moments in that scene, you know that all the power is in the hands of Achilles, and he could cut off this guy's head in a moment. And there's a moment when he shoves Priam away, and what Weil says about that is as if the person with the power just puts their limbs wherever they want, and if a dog or a human happens to be in the way, just shove you out of the way because you don't matter. So yes, he gives him his son back, but he could just as easily, if he was angered by something Priam said, have cut off his head. So I kind of left that scene out with that in mind, that I like to see that scene as a scene where enemies come together, but Weil is making me look at it a little differently and see it as still a scene of force.
Thank you, Cindy. And thank you, John. The next, let's see, it's a comment from Norman Boyer. I also like the attention Homer pays to the Trojan women who become slaves, and there they are in the libation bearers. That's the attention that Weil pays. Thank you, Norman. And then, here's a data point question, Cindy. I'm not sure you have these page numbers at your fingertips. Susan Lippman wonders, what pages from the things they carried did you reference?
Hold on. I can't come up with the pages, but it's a short book, and the essay is called How to Tell a True War Story, and every quote is from that short. So I think that's only about 10 pages long. And I love that title, How to Tell a True War Story. And what he really means is you got to lie, because if you only tell the literal truth, you are not telling the truth about war. And I have been really taken by that idea ever since I read his book.
Thanks, Cindy. Thank you, Susan, for your question. The next question comes from Ilan Sandberg, Ilan asks, how does the constant thread of divine intervention fit into your idea that Homer tells us we mortals have a choice between peace and war?
Mm. Yeah. Well, yeah. Is it just the illusion of a choice? You know, and it's interesting because outside the epic, when we see examples of the warriors being summoned, we see them trying to avoid going. You know, I'm thinking of Odysseus in particular, that when they go to summon Odysseus, he pretends to be crazy. He's just had a son. He doesn't want to go. He's got a wife and a brand new kid. And so he pretends to be crazy, and he sows his field with salt and is plowing the field, hoping that they'll say, oh, he's crazy, we're not taking him to Troy. And one of the men on the mission thinks to throw the baby in front of the plow. And Odysseus stops. Of course, he's not going to harm his son. And they know, okay, he's not crazy, he's coming to war. So you think you have a choice, but somehow you get caught up in the war anyway. And the gods, yes, they figure into it. They change things around. They come in and intervene. So maybe you think you have a choice, and then a god comes down and tells you no. And the example I can think of there is when Helen is by now pretty sick of Paris. And so there's a scene where he comes back from a battle, and she yells at him and says, I'm not going to sleep with you. Well, the goddess, Aphrodite, comes down and says, oh, yes, you will sleep with him or else. So there's Helen asserting her moment of choice, and there's the goddess taking it away from her and telling her, no, a lot has gone into this, and I'm going to make sure you continue to stay with Paris. So it is true that the gods in the Iliad make it seem that you don't always have a choice, and that things go along the way they want them to go. In fact, in those first few lines, we talked about the rage between Achilles and Agamemnon, but among those first lines also is, and the will of Zeus was moving towards its end. That's about 6 lines in, and that makes me and my classes always ask the question, how much of this is in the control of the men? If Achilles stopped raging, or if Agamemnon stopped being offended, could they change things? Or is it no, Zeus has a plan? And is the plan as far as Troy must fall? In which case you guys are all going to play your part because the gods have already planned this out and you don't have a choice. So yeah, definitely for the ancient Greeks, this question of your own choice versus what the gods want, or destiny, is an active question at all times.
Thank you, Cindy. Thank you, Ilan, for your question. The next is a comment from Julie Conway, who says, thank you so much for reviewing The Shield. It brought back wonderful memories of our discussions in the basic program when we experienced the Iliad and Odyssey. Thank you, Julie, for the wonderful advertisement for the basic program. The next question was a comment from Stephen Locascio. Maybe warriors should rule instead of kings, because their motto is my country right or wrong, whereas kings are driven by greed and power. And the next question, this is a follow-up question from Brian Renau, who asks a follow-up to my earlier question, which let me remind you. His earlier question was whether it's realistic to think that that Homer was pleading for peace rather than celebrating war. So now here's a follow-up. Now that I've seen the Iliad's moments of grace, I cannot unsee it. I've always marveled at the blunders and silliness of the supposed heroes, but this is a nice juxtaposition to the moments of grace, where the war heroes are often anti-heroes. So more of a comment than a question. Do you want to?
Kendall, I'm just going to insert, when you run out of questions, there's one I want to answer that hasn't been asked.
Oh, okay, great. All right, let's see here. I have 2 more that end with a question mark. Michael Paulson asks, revenge is a dish best served cold. Does Achilles practice this, knowing that the force of fate is waiting to take his own life? And then Michael cites book 21, lines 119 through 28.
Okay. Revenge is a dish best served cold. I don't think Achilles does follow that. He's ready to pull out of the war. And what pulls him back in, I didn't talk about this much, but Patroclus, becomes very sorry at what's going on with the Greeks, because part of the plan of Zeus is that at Thetis's request, he's asked that the Greeks lose heavily so that they beg Achilles to come back in, and he won't. But his friend Patroclus comes in wearing his armor. So Patroclus goes to war as Achilles and gets killed, and that's what pulls Achilles finally in, and he is red with rage when that happens. And in fact, one book that I've read about Achilles in Vietnam talks about battle rage as a modern thing too, in modern wars. That, you know, someone you care about gets hurt, you see red, and you just wade in and start killing left and right. And it happened then, and it happens now. And that's the phase he's in when he kills Hector. So he does not see this as a dish served cold. He kills Hector when he's plenty hot.
Thank you, Cindy. Thank you, Michael. And I believe this is the final question that I have. It's from Robin Gaston, who asks, thanks for bringing the insights from Simone Weil's essay. Should the perspective on war in the Iliad be seen as the male view, and that females would see it differently?
Wow. No, that's a good point. You know, there's Vey seeing it as a poem about force. Would he writing it, or males reading it, see it that way? It's possible. I guess for some reason this has got me thinking about Homer and Socrates. You know, in the Republic, which we read in the basic program, Socrates says, you know, the ideas that are put forth in the Iliad are not ideas we want to pass on to our kids. And so we need to edit it. And the main thing he wants to edit out is the gods and their bad behavior in this war. So he is a male reading that epic and thinking differently about it than Homer, who wrote it. But I have to admit, I do not see Homer glorifying war. I see him giving space to both sides, mourning the things that are lost on both sides. And he does feel with the women, too. There could be a whole nother lecture on Homer and women in the Iliad and the Odyssey. He has such a feeling for women and their problems that Samuel Butler, I hope fancifully, put forth the theory that at least the Odyssey was written by a woman. And no one really thinks that. But the fact that he proposed it means that he's talking about someone who has such insight into women. And so I'm going to again cite that lament of Thetis's that, you know, was read in class by one student who I think had suffered something in her life. And when she read it, at the end of it, I think we all thought to ourselves, this is a poet who really understands a mother's feelings. Whether, you know, just from poetic insight, you know, or whatever. So even though he might be a man writing about war, he knows something about mothers and their feelings in that lament.
Thank you, Cindy. Another question has come in, a late breaking one from Ilan Sandberg. Ilan asks, do we know if Homer was an actual person and responsible for the totality of these texts? Or is Homer a composite?
Yeah, this is a much vexed question. I think most moderns would say he's a composite. You know, that there are pieces in this poem that seem to hint at periods much earlier than 750, maybe even earlier than 1400 BCE. And so was this, you know, oral tradition, things put together over time, added to over time by many bards? That is quite possible. I prefer to think and talk about him as, you know, a single person Homer. But it could well be the case that this was a compilation over many centuries. Absolutely.
All right, Cindy. So we've reached the end of the questions that I harvested from chat, and you said there's an unasked question.
Yes, yeah, I put this in my lecture, but nobody bid. I said, so I've told you that of the 200 some deaths, 150 are named. So then I got interested. Well, what about the unnamed ones? It turns out there's only 3 episodes of unnamed death in the whole poem. And here's the 3. The night raid of Odysseus and Diomedes. So they go undercover into the Trojan camp, and while they're there, they butcher 12 men who were sleeping. And those men are not named. So my thinking is, and I'm about to give 2 more episodes, is that these are episodes where people are so dehumanized you don't even think about them as humans. You know, they don't get a name, they don't get a eulogy. It's just 12 guys whose throats you slit while they were sleeping. The second instance is Patroclus, when he's wearing Achilles' armor and surging in power. 3 times he assaults, and each of those assaults, 9 Trojans are killed. So a total of 27. And those are not named. And then the last instance, I bet some of the BP students will remember, Achilles is so angry that on the tomb of Patroclus, he rounds up 12 Trojan boys and slits their throats. So he's pretty much treating them as an animal sacrifice. In fact, they occur among a bunch of animal sacrifices that he puts on top of the tomb, including, particularly horrific, Patroclus was often thought of as a very nice guy. He loved his dogs. He had something like 9 dogs. Achilles kills 3 of his dogs on the tomb. And I just can't help but think that Patroclus would say, no, don't kill my dogs. Don't kill 12 Trojans. What are you doing? So those are the only 3 times in the entire Iliad that people die and don't get named.
Thank you, Cindy. A new question has come in. This one is from Barbara Cano, who asks, does Homer believe there is honor in war? Witness Sarpedon's address to Glaucus in Book 12. Is that a moment of grace?
Let's see. Now, I think, is this Sarpedon and Glaucon? Kendall can help correct me on this. I think they're talking about why they fight. And I think one of them is spurring on the other and saying, we have to stand here and fight because this is why people honor us back home. This is why they give us the choicest meats at feasts. It's so because we are honored, we must fight to maintain that honor. So that view is there. But so is Achilles' view of why am I here? Why am I killing Trojans? They never harmed me. So I do think it's interesting that all those views are expressed in various places in the Iliad. So yes, at times people speak for the glory of war, and at other times other people don't.
Well, and if I can, a bit of input, so there's the kind of honor that you can gain in war, like gain honor by killing, which seems, it's at least the direction arrow is differently than the kind that Sarpedon, talks about, where it's because our community, gives us these great orchards and farmlands and the choicest cuts of meat. That's why, so it's almost like paying back for the honor that's already been given.
Mm-hmm. Well, and the other element related to these two is that, for Homer, or for Homeric heroes rather, your honor is your stuff. So do you want a tent filled with the spoils of war? Then you're going to have to fight to get those spoils. No spoils, no honor. That the word is the same. The word for the stuff in your tent is the same as the word for honor. Yeah.
Thanks, Cindy. Now, another question has come in, and since we still have 3 minutes, I'm going to ask it. It's from Maria Perez, who says, hello, everybody. You spoke of glory. How should we interpret the glory when you die and do not live in the moment?
I'm not sure I fully understand the question.
I think. Let's see. I'm guessing, and Maria, type if I paraphrase your question wrongly. Is that so? The warrior who can gain honor from dying, sort of living for tomorrow. Like I'm not going to be here, but I'll live forever in song.
Yes.
In Homeric poetry. So isn't that what kind of an exchange is that? For sacrificing your sense of the present moment.
Yeah. Okay. Now I understand the question. And in fact, when the delegation comes to Achilles from Agamemnon, when Agamemnon finally says, "All right, we're going to try to win him back," and they send a delegation to the tent to offer him all of his stuff back and then some, and Achilles still refuses to go back into the fighting. He says, "My mother had told me that I had 2 possible destinies, and one was I come to Troy and fight, and if I do, I will die there. And I will die young, but my name will live forever. Or I don't go and fight, and I stay at home, and I'll live a long life, but no one will ever know my name." And he chooses the fame. But the Odyssey, the episode in the underworld, the Odyssey, makes you wonder. That's what he chose the first time. Would he do that again now that he has had time to think about it? In the underworld, maybe he wouldn't make that choice again. And that's what I love about Homer, is he shows the first choice, the choice for everlasting fame, and forget about, my long life here. But then he shows in the Odyssey, that might have been the wrong choice. Maybe a long life pulling a plow for somebody else was the way to go.
Thank you, Cindy. And thank you for your great question, Maria. It's a great note to end things on. Everyone is now, I hope, unmuted. So let's applaud our speaker for an excellent talk.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cindy.
Yeah, thank you.
All righty. And thank you, everybody, for coming. I'll now stop the recording.